"Don't open that envelope." That's what my grandmother said to me 3 weeks before she died, and I didn't listen. I wish I had, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where everything actually started, in a hospital room in Thunder Bay on a Tuesday afternoon in February when the snow was coming down so hard you couldn't see the parking lot from the window. My grandmother had been admitted for what the doctors called a cardiac episode. She was 78. She'd lived alone in the house on Balmoral Street for 11 years, ever since my grandfather passed, and she was the kind of woman who would rather collapse at her kitchen table than ask anyone for help. That was just who she was. Private. Careful, watchful in a way I never fully understood until it was too late. I drove up from Toronto the moment my mother called me, 6 hours on the 400 alone in weather that should have kept me home. I don't know why I went so fast. Some feeling I couldn't name, like something was closing and I needed to get there before it shut completely. When I walked into her room, my grandmother looked smaller than I remembered. She had oxygen tubes under her nose and an IV in her left arm, but her eyes were sharp. They were always sharp. She waited until the nurse left before she said anything. "Nora," she said. Not my name, actually. She had a name for me that nobody else used, a family nickname, something between us. But for this story, you can call me what she called me in serious moments. She called me by my real name. She called me Whitney. "Whitney," she said. "Come close." I pulled the chair up to her bed and took her hand. It was cold. It was always cold. She told me there was an envelope in the house. In the house on Balmoral Street, inside the third drawer of her writing desk, underneath the address book she'd had since 1987. She told me the envelope had my name on it. My real name, written in her handwriting, underlined twice. "I need you to take it," she said, "before anyone else goes into that house. Don't tell your mother. Don't tell your uncle. Take it and read it alone and do what it says." I asked her what was inside. She looked at the window for a moment, the snow. "The truth about your grandfather's estate," she said. "The truth that I should have spoken 12 years ago and didn't have the courage for." She squeezed my hand once, hard, and then the nurse came back and the moment was over. My grandmother had 4 children. My mother was the youngest. Then came my uncle. We'll call him by what I always called him, which was just uncle because that's how it felt, a category, not a name. And then 2 aunts who lived out west and stayed out west and had largely removed themselves from family drama through geographic distance, which I have always respected as a life strategy. My uncle was the one who handled things. That was the family understanding, established before I was old enough to question it. He was the oldest son. He understood finances. He had a head for numbers, everyone said, and he'd been helping my grandmother with her accounts for years. Ever since my grandfather's heart attack. What nobody said out loud, what I only understood much later, was that helping with her accounts meant my uncle had signing authority on my grandmother's checking account. He paid her bills for her. He managed her investments. He was, in every practical sense, the one who controlled the money. My grandmother had let this happen gradually, not because she was confused, not because she couldn't do it herself. She was sharp until the end, as I said. She let it happen because my uncle had insisted, and insisting was something he was very good at. And my grandmother was a woman of her generation who had been taught that the men in the family handled money. She had absorbed that lesson deeply enough that unlearning it felt, I think, like a kind of disloyalty to her own past. But she had kept a secret, and that secret was in the third drawer of her writing desk on Balmoral Street. I went to the house the next morning, before anyone else was up. I have a key, had always had a key, since I was 16, and would sometimes stay with my grandmother on weekends when Toronto felt like too much. I let myself in through the side door and stood in her kitchen for a moment, in the dark, smelling coffee that wasn't there anymore and listening to the furnace run. The writing desk was in what my grandmother called the sitting room, which was a room nobody sat in except her. It had her china cabinet and her good lamp and a wingback chair she'd reupholstered herself in 1994, which she was very proud of. I found the envelope in the third drawer, exactly where she said, underneath the address book. My name on the front in blue ink, underlined twice. I didn't open it there. I put it in my bag and I drove back to the hospital and I sat in the parking lot and I thought about what she'd said. Before anyone else goes into that house. That told me something. Someone else was planning to go into that house. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things. The first was a letter, 4 pages, in my grandmother's handwriting, dated 2 months earlier, so she had written this before the hospital, before the cardiac episode, while she was still living on her own and managing her own days. She had planned this. The second was a photocopy of a bank statement. A GIC, a guaranteed investment certificate, held at a branch of TD Bank in Thunder Bay. The account was in my grandmother's name. The account had been opened in 2008. The balance on the statement, which was dated the previous October, was a little over $340,000. The third was a handwritten note, separate from the letter, that said, "Ask for the complete transaction history. Ask who has been making withdrawals. Ask for everything in writing." I read the letter first. My grandmother wrote carefully. She was not a woman who used extra words. She explained that when my grandfather died in 2012, he left an estate that included the house on Balmoral Street, their joint savings, and a life insurance payout of $400,000. She had been the sole beneficiary. The money had come to her. She explained that within a year of my grandfather's death, my uncle had begun what she described as helpfully reorganizing her finances. He had consolidated accounts. He had moved money. He had explained things to her using terminology she didn't always follow, and when she asked questions, he had been patient with her in the particular way that made her feel foolish for asking. Over the next several years, she had noticed her account balances declining, not dramatically. Gradually. Small amounts, then slightly larger amounts, spread over time in a way that looked, on the surface, like ordinary expenses. Heating bills, property taxes, car maintenance. She had trusted the numbers because the numbers came from him. The GICE was the only account my uncle didn't know about. She had opened it herself quietly by walking into a different branch of TD than the one she usually used, and depositing the insurance money before my uncle was aware it existed. She had kept the statements delivered to a P.O. box she paid for herself in cash from her grocery money. She had done this because, even in her grief, even in those first raw weeks after my grandfather died, something had made her careful. "I want you to have this account," she wrote. "I have updated the beneficiary designation to your name. You do not need to go through probate. You go to the bank, you bring your identification and this letter, and the money is yours. But before you do that, I need you to ask them something. I need you to ask about the joint account, the one your uncle manages. I need you to ask for the full history." She didn't tell me what she thought I would find. She didn't have to. My grandmother died 9 days later. A second cardiac event, more serious than the first. My mother was with her. I was in the waiting room. By the time I got into the room, she was already gone. I cried in a bathroom stall for 20 minutes, then I washed my face and went back out. The week that followed was the kind of week that happens in families after a death, the specific chaos of logistics and grief and old resentments that don't have time to stay buried because there's too much to arrange. My uncle took charge immediately. Of course he did. He called the funeral home. He called the lawyer who had my grandmother's will on file. He organized the lunch after the service. He was efficient and composed in a way that some people found comforting and that I found increasingly impossible to look at directly. My mother kept asking me if I was all right. I kept saying yes. I had told her nothing about the envelope. I want to be clear about why. Not because I was hiding something from my mother, but because my grandmother had asked me not to, and because I had learned something from the letter about the way information moves in families, about how quickly something private becomes communal and then becomes a conversation my uncle is standing in the middle of. I needed to understand what I was holding before I handed any part of it to anyone else. So I waited. Through the funeral, through the lunch, through my uncle standing in my grandmother's kitchen, telling my mother which pieces of furniture he thought should go, to whom I waited, 10 days after the funeral, I drove back to Thunder Bay. I went to the TD branch that my grandmother had specified in her letter. I asked to speak with someone about a deceased account holder and an estate matter. They brought me into a small office and offered me a coffee that I accepted but didn't drink. I explained that I was the named beneficiary on a GIC account. I had the account number from the statement. I had my identification. I had the letter. The woman helping me, let's call her the account manager because that's what she was, looked at the account details on her screen for a moment, and then she looked at me, and then she looked back at the screen. She said, "I'll be right back." She was gone for about 4 minutes. When she came back, there was someone else with her. A man older, the branch manager, based on how he introduced himself. He shook my hand. He sat down. He said, "Before we process anything, I need to ask you a few questions." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you aware of any other accounts your grandmother held at this branch?" I said I was not. He turned his monitor slightly toward me. Not enough that I could read the numbers, but enough that I could see the shape of them. He said, "This joint account, which your grandmother shared with a cosigner, has anyone spoken to you about recent activity on this account?" I said no. I said that's actually why I was there. My grandmother had asked me to inquire. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I think you may want to speak with a lawyer before you leave this branch today. And I want to make sure you understand, you may want to contact the Ontario Securities Commission or potentially the police." I heard myself say, "Why?" He said, "Because what I'm looking at suggests that over a period of approximately 7 years, there have been a series of transfers out of your grandmother's joint account that do not appear to be consistent with normal household expenses. The total across all those transfers is significant." I asked him how significant. He told me the number. It was $312,000. I sat in that office for a long time. Long enough that the account manager brought me a glass of water without me asking. Long enough that I had to call and push back a meeting I was supposed to be on in Toronto. The branch manager explained what he could and what he couldn't tell me. Privacy law, estate law, the limits of what a bank employee can share with a beneficiary versus an account holder. He was careful and precise and clearly uncomfortable, and I respected that about him even in that moment when respect was hard to manufacture. What he could tell me was that the transfers had a pattern. They went to an account in another name. They were done online from a device that was not my grandmother's. The earliest one was in 2016. The most recent one was 4 months ago. 4 months ago, my grandmother was alive. She was in her house on Balmoral Street making her own grocery lists and tending her African violets and paying for a P.O. box in cash. She knew. She had known for some time. And she had protected the one account she could, and she had written me a letter, and she had waited. I thought about what she had said in the hospital. The truth I should have spoken 12 years ago and didn't have the courage for. She had been watching it happen, piece by piece, year by year, and she had been afraid of conflict, of family fracture, of being called confused or difficult or ungrateful by the son who was helping her. She had been afraid of all the things women of her generations were taught to be afraid of. So she had stayed quiet, and she had been careful, and she had saved what she could save. For me, I called a lawyer from the parking lot, not the family lawyer, not the one who'd had her will on file for 20 years. Someone new, someone who had no existing relationship with anyone in my family. I found a name through the Thunder Bay Law Association referral line, and I called and I got an appointment for the next morning. Then I sat in my car and I cried again. Not for long. I was running out of time for crying. The next several months were the hardest of my life in a particular way. Not the hardest emotionally, because losing my grandmother was harder than any of what came next, but the hardest in the specific exhaustion of being methodical when you want to scream, of filing documents and making phone calls and attending meetings while also going to work and sleeping and pretending for a while that nothing was happening. My lawyer was thorough. She filed a complaint with the Ontario Securities Commission. She contacted the police, specifically the Financial Crimes Unit of the Thunder Bay Police Service. She made a formal demand on my uncle's behalf, no, against my uncle, for a full accounting of all transactions in my grandmother's joint account. He denied it. Of course he did. He said the transfers were for expenses. He said my grandmother had authorized everything. He said I was a grieving young woman who was misinterpreting normal financial management. He said specifically that I was always the dramatic one. That's almost a direct quote. My mother told me he said it at a family dinner I wasn't invited to. What he hadn't anticipated, what I think truly hadn't occurred to him, was that my grandmother had kept records, not on a computer, in a notebook. A small green spiral notebook that she had stored, with her characteristic tidiness, in the same drawer as the envelope. I had found it when I went back for the letter, and I had taken it without fully understanding what it was. It was a ledger. 11 years of entries in her careful blue handwriting, dates, amounts, and in the third column, a word or phrase. Transferred, Reg's account. Reg was my uncle's name, Reginald. She had written it out in full every single time. She had documented everything, quietly, alone, in her sitting room in her wingback chair with her good lamp. 11 years. My lawyer said she had never seen anything quite like it. Not the fraud. Unfortunately, elder financial abuse was not uncommon, she said, and families were statistically the most common perpetrators. So what she had rarely seen was a victim who had this level of documentation, this level of foresight. She said, "Your grandmother was a very deliberate woman." I said, "Yes, she was." The investigation took 8 months. I won't walk through every step because some of it is still too close and some of it isn't mine to tell in detail. What I can tell you is that my uncle was charged financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, 3 charges, all federal. He pled not guilty. There was a trial in Thunder Bay in the spring. I attended every day I could. My mother came to 2 of the days. She sat beside me and held my hand and didn't say much, which was the right thing. My uncle's defense was that my grandmother had given him authority and approval, that the transfers were consensual, that the notebook was the confused record-keeping of an elderly woman who didn't understand her own accounts. The Crown showed the jury the notebook. They read it back in a week. Guilty on all 3 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to make full restitution, the $312,000, plus interest calculated from the date of the first transfer. His house, which, the investigation revealed, had been purchased with a down payment that came partially from my grandmother's accounts, was subject to a civil asset recovery action that is still ongoing as I record this. My mother didn't come for the sentencing. I understood. He was her brother. She had grown up with him. She was allowed to have complicated feelings. The important thing is that she had believed me actually, from the moment I showed her the notebook, which I did before I showed it to anyone official. I needed her to know first. That mattered to me. My grandmother's will left the house on Balmoral Street to all 4 of her children equally. After the restitution order, the civil proceedings, and the estate accounting, the net value of her estate was lower than it should have been. That's a fact I sit with sometimes. But the GIC, the $340,000 she had protected carefully, deliberately, in a separate account at a separate branch with a separate P.O. box that came to me directly as a named beneficiary outside of the estate. No probate, no waiting, no committee decision. She had done it that way on purpose. I used part of it to pay the legal fees, which were significant. I kept the rest. I haven't spent much of it. It sits in a high-interest savings account, and I look at the balance sometimes and think about my grandmother, in her sitting room, in her good lamplight, writing numbers in a green notebook and trusting that someday someone would understand what she was saying. I understood. I'm sorry it took me until after she was gone. The question I get asked most when I've told pieces of this story to people I trust is, how did she stay quiet for so long? How did she watch it happen and not say anything? And I think about that a lot. I think about who my grandmother was. A woman who had been told her whole life that the men handled the money, that family loyalty meant absorbing rather than confronting, that making waves was worse than keeping the peace. I think about how she watched my uncle take a little, and then a little more, and how every time she might have said something, there was a reason not to. He would be hurt. The family would be divided. People would think she was confused. She was never confused. She was watching. She was writing it down. She was protecting what she could protect for as long as she could protect it until she found the right moment and the right person. I was the right person. I don't know if I deserved to be. I just know I tried to be worthy of what she left me, not the money. The truth. There's a line I keep coming back to from her letter. Near the end of the 4 pages, in her careful, unhurried handwriting, she wrote, "I am not leaving you this because you are owed it. I am leaving it to you because you are the one in this family who asks questions. Don't stop asking. I'm 31 years old. I live in Toronto. I work in healthcare administration, which is not glamorous, but which I am good at. I have a small balcony where I grow tomatoes in the summer, badly, the way my grandmother grew them in her backyard on Balmoral Street, not badly at all. I call my mother every Sunday. I still have the green notebook. It's in my bedside drawer. I don't open it much, but I know it's there, and knowing is enough. My grandmother waited 11 years for someone to believe her. I believe her. I will always believe her. And if you are sitting somewhere right now thinking about a parent, a grandparent, someone you love who has someone else helping with their finances, pay attention. Ask questions. Look at the accounts. Ask for the full history. Don't wait until you're opening an envelope in a parking lot in February while the snow comes down and the person who trusted you is already gone. Don't wait that long.